Did you know that a company can be made to pay tax even when it does not make any profit? Well, it's actually okay if you didn't know, because I believe that after watching this video, you will understand how that works in Nigeria. To start with, companies pay tax on their profits and not their revenue. And in calculating assessable profits or total profits that will be subject to tax, a company is entitled to deduct all expenses that are wholly and exclusively incurred for the purposes of generating the profits. So if, for example, a company generates revenue of 100 million naira, but in generating that revenue, it also incurred expenses of 95 million naira, it is not the 100 million that will be subject to tax, but only 5 million, because in that instance, the company will be entitled to deduct the 95 million naira from the revenue. And if it happens that after deducting all allowable expenses, a company does not have any taxable or assessable profit, the company should not be paying tax for that year. However, there are certain instances where even when a company has not made profit, or it even suffers a loss, it can still be made to pay tax. Now, under the new tax laws, the Nigeria Revenue Service is empowered to tax the revenue of a company. This power can be exercised where a company does not have any assessable profits, or it has accessible profits that are, in the opinion of the Nigeria Revenue Service, are lower than what the company ought to have generated in a year, or the accessible profits of the company cannot be ascertained for any reason. And where the Nigeria Revenue Service exercises this power, it can tax the revenue of the company and not the profit of the company. So if we're to take our hypothetical company that generated revenue of 100 million, incurred expenses of 95 million, and ended up with a profit of 5 million, the NRS, if it decides to exercise these powers, can take the view that it would not be taxing the 5 million, but in that instance, it can deem a fair and reasonable proportion of the revenue as the profits of the company and apply tax on that portion of the revenue. The Companies Income Tax Act, which has now been repealed, also contained a similar provision, and I know that the FIRS, now the NRS, regularly exercised these powers, especially in relation to non-resident companies. Another interesting thing about these powers of the tax authority is that there is no formula or criteria in the law that provide a guide on what proportion of the revenue of the company that can be treated as a fair and reasonable proportion that will be subject to tax. However, the FIRS in practice typically treated 20% of revenue as the profits of a company and applied tax at the rate of 30% on that 20% of revenue. And it is very possible that the NRS will continue this practice of treating 20% of revenue as profit. So if the NRS were to treat 20% of the revenue of the hypothetical company that we mentioned, it would mean that instead of paying tax on 5 million, which is the profit, the company would be liable to pay tax on 20 million naira, which of course would definitely increase the tax bill of the company for that year. So in essence, or in summary, this is how a company that does not make profits or even suffers a loss can be made to pay tax in Nigeria, because it is entirely within the discretion of the revenue to decide what proportion of the revenue it would treat as profits. So it may be that a company had suffered a loss, but the Nigeria Revenue Service then takes the view that instead of the loss that was reported, the company should have actually made profit, or that it could not ascertain the profits of the company, and then in that case subject the company to tax for that year.